In the candlelit glow of Regency England, the world seemed wrapped in elegance. Picture grand ballrooms filled with the rustle of silk gowns, powdered faces half hidden behind delicate fans, and the polished steps of the waltz echoing across marble floors. It was a time that appears, at first glance, perfect and serene, a place where etiquette and grace reigned supreme. Yet behind the glittering chandeliers and refined manners lurked a world far more complex. One where women lived inside cages built not of iron but of custom, reputation, and expectation. Beneath the polished surface was a quiet rebellion, often invisible to those who only saw the sparkle of the age. When we think of the Regency era, what often comes to mind are novels of romance, gallant suitors, and heroines who find themselves swept into love stories with happy endings. But reality was not always as rosy. For many women, the period was defined not by choice but by constraint. Marriage was less about romance than survival. Property rights belonged to men, and a woman's reputation could be destroyed by something as simple as a rumor whispered in the wrong ear. This world may look enchanting in costume dramas, but its polished exterior hid lives filled with unspoken battles. Yet even within such a rigid society, there were sparks of defiance. Women began to write, to paint, to gather in salons where ideas could flow as freely as the tea poured into porcelain cups. Some dared to speak aloud what others barely dared to think. Some, like Mary Wollstonecraft, challenged the very foundations of education and equality. Others, like Lister, lived boldly in ways that scandalized their peers but carved new paths of freedom. And still others quietly pushed the edges of art, literature, and conversation, slowly expanding the space in which women could exist. What makes this story so compelling is not only the courage of these women, but also the ripples they created. Their choices, their writings, their acts of defiance, whether quiet or loud, began to shift the fabric of their world. Though the changes were not immediate, the foundations of later reforms and movements for women's rights were being laid in those candlelit parlors and private diaries. These rebels, both visible and hidden, remind us that progress often begins with whispers before it becomes a roar. As we explore their stories, we will uncover the tension between the image of the Regency era and the reality beneath it. We will meet women who refused to conform, who endured scandal, who wrote against silence, and who lived with an authenticity that still inspires today. Their lives remind us that history is never as simple as it appears, and that even in the most restrictive times, there are those who find ways to challenge, resist, and dream of something more. Welcome to our channel Words of Time. And in this video, we will journey behind the fan and the frock to uncover the hidden lives of Regency women, exploring their struggles, their defiance, and the legacy they left for the generations that followed. The image of the Regency era is often painted in soft pastels, with young ladies drifting through candlelit ballrooms in gauzy dresses while gallant gentlemen wait to claim their hands for a dance. This is the world made familiar by novels and films, one that seems graceful, charming, and filled with romance. Yet when one looks past the fan fluttering in a lady's hand and the frock draped across her frame, a harsher picture comes into view. The Regency years were not only about delicate fashions and genteel gatherings. They were also defined by suffocating rules, the iron grip of societal expectations, and the quiet struggles of women whose lives were bound by constraints they could rarely escape. To understand this world, it is necessary to see both the shimmering surface and the shadows that lay beneath it. For women born into this time, social rules were not optional. They were embedded into nearly every moment of life, from childhood lessons to the final choice of a husband. A young girl in a genteel family was raised to become an ornament of the household, someone who could display grace, beauty, and obedience. Her education was limited and carefully controlled. Instead of science, politics, or philosophy, she was often taught music, drawing, French, and sewing. These accomplishments were meant not to broaden her mind, but to improve her marriage prospects. The idea was that a young woman should appear cultured enough to entertain, and refined enough to impress, but never so knowledgeable that she might overshadow her husband. This careful balance created a paradox. Women were expected to charm but not challenge, to shine but not too brightly. Marriage was the defining goal of nearly every woman's life, not out of choice but necessity. The law did not give them independence in the way it did men. A daughter's inheritance was often tied up with her father's estate, and if she remained unmarried, she risked lifelong dependence on her relatives. Once married, the situation did not improve. A wife's legal identity merged with her husband's, which meant she could not own property, sign contracts, or control her own income. All that she might bring to the marriage, whether in dowry or inheritance, legally belonged to her husband. Marriage, therefore, was not simply a union of affection but an economic and social transaction. Families viewed it as a way to secure wealth, stability, and alliances, often with little regard for the personal desires of the woman involved. For many women, this meant living in a constant state of performance. Every public act carried weight. A careless remark, an immodest dress, or a misplaced flirtation could damage a reputation beyond repair. Reputation was everything. A young lady who lost hers was effectively shut out of respectable society, leaving her with very few options other than poverty or dependence on distant relations. The importance placed on chastity, modesty, and perfect decorum was a cage disguised as gentility. Even genuine feelings had to be concealed. A woman could not openly express her desires, frustrations, or ambitions without risking censure. Silence and restraint were virtues, while honesty and boldness were treated as faults. The drawing rooms and ballrooms that seem so romantic from a modern perspective were also arenas of pressure. A young woman was displayed like a prize, assessed not only for her beauty but for her family connections and fortune. Conversations were polite on the surface, but charged with calculation underneath. A smile could secure interest, a misstep could repel it, and every dance was a performance in the theater of courtship. For men, these gatherings offered choice and power. For women, they were trials, each one another chance to succeed or fail in the lifelong game of finding a suitable husband. Beneath this elaborate social structure was a deeper current of desperation. Many women longed for more than the narrow role carved out for them. Some expressed this through diaries and letters, quietly admitting their frustrations at the lack of freedom. Others turned to writing or art as a way to push against the boundaries. Yet even these outlets were limited. Female authors often published anonymously or under male names to avoid criticism. Creativity, intelligence, and ambition were not forbidden in theory, but in practice, they were rarely rewarded unless carefully hidden beneath a mask of acceptable femininity. The legal system reinforced the limits. Property rights were stacked firmly against women. A father might leave wealth to his daughter, but once she married, control shifted to her husband. If the marriage turned cruel or neglectful, the wife had little recourse. Divorce was almost impossible, requiring a special act of parliament that few could ever hope to obtain. Separation carried its own scandal and left a woman socially vulnerable. Even widows, who sometimes regained financial independence, were often seen as objects of suspicion, their autonomy treated as unusual or threatening. The weight of reputation extended to nearly every part of life. Even small indulgences, such as laughter that was too loud or a walk taken without the right companion, could trigger gossip. Men could recover from social missteps, but women rarely could. A gentleman who gambled or drank to excess might still maintain his place in society. A lady who committed even the smallest breach of propriety could be ruined. The double standard was clear, and women bore the heavier burden. This environment bred a quiet form of resistance, though it was rarely open rebellion. Many women learned to express themselves through subtlety. A carefully worded letter, a satirical drawing, or a pointed remark hidden under layers of politeness could reveal dissatisfaction without stepping too far outside the lines. Some women navigated the system with skill, using their reputations as tools to influence husbands or brothers. Others found small freedoms in the privacy of friendships, where they could confide what they could not say aloud in public. Still, the sense of constraint was heavy. The fan and the frock, outward symbols of elegance and refinement, also became emblems of disguise. Behind the delicate fabric and painted smiles lay the truth of lives tightly controlled. Women were often praised as the moral centers of their families, yet this praise came at the cost of personal freedom. They were expected to uphold standards they had no role in creating, to serve as guardians of virtue in a society that left them powerless. The contrast between the idyllic surface and the hidden reality gives the Regency era its haunting complexity. It was a time of beauty, artistry, and refinement, but also of deep inequity and silent suffering. While history often remembers the grand houses, the glittering balls, and the romantic courtships, it is just as important to remember the lives that played out in the shadows of those scenes. These were lives filled with restraint, sacrifice, and the constant pressure of societal judgment. When we look back now, we see not only the romance but also the reality. The Regency world offered women few paths and fewer choices. Behind every graceful curtsy and every whispered conversation at a dance was the knowledge that failure to marry well, or to maintain a flawless reputation, could mean a lifetime of limitation. The stories of quiet endurance, subtle rebellion, and unspoken longing are as much a part of that era as the silks and chandeliers. To understand the period fully, one must look beyond the surface charms and acknowledge the cage of expectations that confines so many women within it. The tale of women in the Regency era cannot rest solely on images of constraint, resignation, and suffocating propriety. For even within the cage, there were sparks of resistance. These sparks did not usually appear in open defiance, for the cost of rebellion could be ruin. Instead, they flickered in subtler forms, in sharp words, in secret gatherings, in writing that stretched the boundaries of what was deemed acceptable. Yet sometimes, rebellion burst out more dramatically, embodied in figures who refused to remain within the frame designed for them. To trace these moments is to see the first ripples of change, faint but undeniable, as women began to shape lives outside the script that society wrote for them. Among these figures, Lady Caroline Lamb stands as one of the most striking. Born into privilege, she had everything that ought to have secured her place within society: a distinguished family, a proper education for a girl of her station, and eventually a marriage to William Lamb, who would later become Lord Melbourne, a future Prime Minister. Yet Caroline refused to stay within the lines. She was witty, passionate, and restless, unwilling to bury her emotions beneath the veil of perfect decorum. Her life became a living rejection of the silent obedience expected from women of her time. Her most famous act of rebellion came in the form of her affair with Lord Byron, the brooding poet whose own life was marked by scandal and excess. Their relationship was explosive, filled with passion, quarrels, and very public displays that shocked polite society. Caroline was not discreet. She wrote Byron letters, pursued him when he withdrew, and even attended events wearing costumes meant to provoke attention. To the guardians of propriety, her behavior was not simply a personal failing, but a direct challenge to the structure of society. A woman was not meant to express desire openly, nor was she meant to turn heartbreak into spectacle. Yet Caroline did both, and in doing so, she forced those around her to confront the possibility that women, too, had inner lives filled with longing and rage. Her defiance did not stop at her personal relationships. Caroline wrote fiction, most famously her novel Glenarvan, a thinly veiled account of her affair with Byron, portraying him as a seductive but destructive figure. Publishing such a work was daring. While men could expose personal scandals in poetry and memoirs, women who did the same risked condemnation far more severe. Caroline was indeed ridiculed, mocked, and eventually marginalized by many of her peers. Yet she also left a mark. In refusing to silence herself, she opened a space, however small, for the idea that women's voices, even when messy or scandalous, deserved to be heard. What made Caroline both fascinating and troubling to her contemporaries was the visibility of her rebellion. She was not a quiet dissenter hidden in a drawing room. She was loud, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. Some saw her as a cautionary tale, proof of what happened when a woman abandoned modesty. Others, though they might never say so openly, saw in her a reflection of emotions they themselves suppressed. She embodied the tension between societal expectations and private desire, a tension that defined the lives of countless women in her age. But rebellion did not always take the form of scandalous affairs and dramatic scenes. For some, it took the quieter and more enduring form of intellectual pursuit. In the same period that Caroline was shocking the ton with her behavior, another group of women were carving out spaces where thought itself became an act of resistance. These women were the Bluestockings, a circle of intellectuals who gathered to discuss literature, philosophy, and art. Elizabeth Montagu, one of the most prominent of this circle, used her wealth and position to host salons where men and women could exchange ideas. This in itself was revolutionary. At a time when women were discouraged from public debate and confined to the domestic sphere, Montague and her peers created environments where female intellect was not only welcomed but celebrated. They read poetry, debated philosophy, and engaged with the pressing questions of the age. While they did not overthrow the structures of society, they quietly eroded the idea that women were incapable of serious thought. The Bluestockings were not radicals in the sense of demanding political upheaval. They were often careful to maintain their respectability, dressing modestly and avoiding behaviors that might be deemed scandalous. Yet their very existence was a challenge. By bringing women together in spaces of intellectual equality, they undermined the assumption that a woman's value lay only in beauty or marriage. They showed that women could shape culture, contribute to literature, and engage in the same conversations that men did. The influence of the Bluestockings reached far beyond the walls of their gatherings. They inspired younger women to take education more seriously, to read widely, and to write without apology. The fact that Montague herself was a writer who gained recognition for her essays and letters demonstrated that female authorship could command respect without hiding behind a male pseudonym. This legacy planted seeds that would grow in the decades to come, as more and more women found ways to make their voices heard in print. The contrast between Lady Caroline Lamb and Elizabeth Montague reveals the varied paths of rebellion available to women in the Regency world. One fought against propriety with passion and scandal, leaving behind a trail of gossip but also works that dared to tell her story. The other cultivated a world of thought and conversation, using respectability as a shield to protect her radical belief in women's intellect. Both approaches mattered. Both chipped away at the rigid image of the silent, ornamental woman, offering glimpses of alternatives. These early ripples of rebellion were not yet a wave, but they mattered because they revealed possibility. Women could be passionate, creative, and intellectual. They could be more than wives and mothers, more than figures moving silently through ballrooms. Even if society tried to silence them, their voices reached through letters, novels, and conversations. The importance of these figures lies not only in what they achieved, but in what they represented. Caroline showed that emotion, even when it broke the bounds of propriety, was real and human. Montague and her Bluestocking peers showed that intellect was not bound by gender. Together, they expanded the imagination of what women could be, planting ideas that would bloom more fully in later generations. As the Regency era drifted into history, it left behind both its glittering surface and its deeper struggles. Yet in the lives of women like Caroline and Montague, we glimpsed the beginnings of change. Behind the fan and the frock, behind the rigid expectations of silence and modesty, voices had begun to stir. They were not yet loud enough to overturn the system, but they were strong enough to remind the world that women's lives could not be contained forever within a cage of decorum. The currents of quiet resistance that began with figures like Lady Caroline Lamb and the Bluestockings did not stop at scandalous affairs or intellectual salons. Another powerful strand of defiance ran through the arts, where women, constrained in daily life, began to shape identities and claim voices in the worlds of writing and painting. These artistic endeavors were not only acts of creativity, but also subtle challenges to the structures that confined them. To paint or to write was, for many women, to carve out a corner of independence in a society that denied them both power and property. It was a way of expressing what could not be said aloud, of testing boundaries in ways that appeared acceptable on the surface, but carried deeper significance underneath. Writing was perhaps the most accessible form of expression, though it still carried heavy risks. Women had been reading novels in great numbers since the 18th century, and by the Regency period, more and more of them began writing their own. Yet to publish was no simple decision. Female authors risked ridicule, moral suspicion, or worse, the accusation that they had abandoned modesty. Respectable women were supposed to be silent in public matters, their words confined to private letters or the gentle chatter of the drawing room. To place one's thoughts into print and circulate them to strangers was, in the eyes of many, immodest, if not scandalous. Despite this, women persisted, sometimes under their own names, sometimes under male pseudonyms or anonymous titles. Jane Austen, perhaps the most enduring figure of this period, published her early novels simply as a lady. This choice both concealed her identity and highlighted the fact that her gender mattered in how her work might be judged. Austen's novels, though restrained in tone and set within the domestic sphere, were anything but safe. Beneath their polished sentences and quiet country settings lay sharp critiques of the marriage market, the limitations of inheritance laws, and the pressure placed on women to secure survival through matrimony. By focusing on the small details of everyday life, Austen revealed the deep inequalities that structured it. Her art was subtle, but its implications were profound. Other writers pushed boundaries more openly. Maria Edgeworth, for example, tackled issues of education and social reform in her novels, weaving moral questions into her plots. Women like her claimed the authority to comment on public issues, even if they couched them in fictional form. This was itself a rebellion, since female opinions on politics or law were often dismissed if stated directly. By embedding these concerns in stories, they made them harder to ignore. For some, writing offered more than just a platform, it was a path toward independence. While few female authors grew wealthy, the income from publishing could provide rare financial freedom. A woman who earned her own money, even modestly, carved out a space of autonomy within a society that otherwise tied her fortune to father or husband. This economic aspect added another layer to the importance of writing as rebellion. Painting, though less public, provided another avenue of subtle resistance. Women had long been encouraged to sketch or dabble in watercolor as part of their accomplishments, but professional artistic careers were discouraged. The accepted image was of a young lady producing delicate landscapes or still life pieces to decorate a family home, not of a woman seeking commissions or critical recognition. Yet many women pushed beyond these limits. Angelica Kauffman, though slightly earlier than the Regency, had already shown what was possible, gaining fame across Europe for her portraits and history paintings. Her success left an impression on later generations of women, suggesting that art could be more than a pastime. By the early 19th century, women artists were increasingly present in exhibitions, even if they faced barriers to training and recognition. The Royal Academy in London admitted very few women, and they were excluded from life-drawing classes that involved studying the nude, a foundation of serious artistic training. Despite this, women adapted, honing their skills in other ways and producing works that rivaled those of their male contemporaries. Portraiture became one of the most important spaces for female artists. Painting the likenesses of family, friends, and patrons allowed women to claim authority as creators of identity. These portraits were not only pictures but also statements, showing women not as passive beauties, but as thinking, feeling individuals. Some artists also turned to landscapes, imbuing natural scenes with moods and interpretations that reflected personal vision. While their work might appear modest on the surface, the very act of stepping into the role of professional painter carried meaning. It contradicted the expectation that a woman's art should remain private, unseen beyond the walls of her home. Both writing and painting shared a quality of layered subtlety. On one level, they could be framed as acceptable accomplishments, enhancing the reputation of a refined lady. On another, they carried a charge of defiance, since they required women to claim intellectual or creative authority in a world that denied it to them. Many of these works, whether novels or canvases, explored the very tensions of the lives their creators lived: marriage as necessity, reputation as cage, freedom as dream. The arts became mirrors, reflecting back the struggles of women, while also hinting at alternative ways of being. These early endeavors also fostered communities. Writers corresponded with one another, sharing encouragement and criticism. Artists gathered in informal circles, offering mutual support where institutions shut them out. These networks were vital, for they provided a sense that women were not entirely alone in their efforts. The Bluestockings had created spaces for discussion, and now creative women built on that legacy, forming bonds that sustained their work against a tide of resistance. It is important to recognize that not every woman who wrote or painted saw herself as a rebel. Some were content to work within accepted limits, while others may not have intended to challenge society at all. Yet the act itself carried weight regardless of intent. Every published novel, every displayed portrait, was a reminder that women's minds and hands could shape culture. Even when their works were dismissed or patronized, The fact that they existed mattered. They were cracks in the facade of silence, evidence that women were beginning to claim space in the public imagination. In these subtle acts of creation, we see the continuation of the same currents that ran through Lady Caroline Lamb's public scandal and Elizabeth Montagu's private salons. Whether through drama, intellect, or artistry, women were testing the edges of the roles assigned to them. They were beginning to push against the notion that their value lay solely in obedience, beauty, or marriage. Some did so noisily, others quietly, but all contributed to the slow erosion of barriers that had long seemed immovable. The Regency world, with its glittering surfaces and rigid rules, might have appeared fixed in its hierarchies. Yet beneath that polished exterior, women's voices and visions were beginning to stir. Through novels that dissected social pressures, through portraits that captured individuality, through gatherings that fostered thought, women found ways to speak. These were not revolutions that overturned society in an instant, but they were ripples that spread outward, changing how women saw themselves and how others would one day see them. The fan and the frock still define the outward image of the Regency woman, but behind them, pens and brushes were at work. Every line written, every stroke painted, was an assertion of presence. These early artistic endeavors, born in a world of limitation, revealed not just creativity but resilience. They whispered of lives too large to be contained, of minds too sharp to be silenced, and of futures that might one day hold more freedom than the women of this era could imagine. The threads of subtle rebellion that began with creative work and the quiet spaces of salons soon gave way to figures whose very existence seemed to cry out against the structures of their world. It is one thing to bend rules gently, to write novels that expose inequality, to paint portraits that assert the individuality of women, to host gatherings where minds meet in intellectual exchange. It is quite another to step into the storm and call openly for a transformation of the order itself, or to live in a way that discards propriety entirely. In the Regency and the years surrounding it, several women dared this bolder path. Their lives and works were often met with scandal, outrage, or ridicule, but they also carved out a vision of freedom that reached beyond the quiet whispers of discontent. Mary Wollstonecraft stands at the heart of this shift. Though her most influential work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, was published in the closing years of the 18th century, her ideas rippled into the Regency and beyond. She wrote at a time when women were still largely treated as ornamental creatures, raised to please and to serve. Against this backdrop, Wollstonecraft's argument landed like thunder. She declared, with clarity and force, that women were not naturally inferior to men, but were made so by lack of education and opportunity. To give women proper schooling was not to threaten society, but to strengthen it, for educated women would make better companions, better mothers, and better citizens. Her ideas challenged the very foundation of the system that kept women silent. If women were capable of reason, and if reason was the basis of moral worth, then how could they be denied the rights of full human beings? It was a radical challenge to a world that wanted to see women only as wives, mothers, or mistresses. Wollstonecraft demanded that women be seen as individuals, with minds and souls of their own. She was not simply writing for the sake of theory. Her own life reflected her arguments. She supported herself through writing and teaching, lived independently, and made choices in love that defied the conventions of marriage. Her relationship with the philosopher William Godwin was unconventional, and her legacy was marked as much by her audacity in living as by her boldness in writing. Her detractors seized on her personal life to dismiss her ideas. They pointed to her love affairs, to the fact that she bore a child out of wedlock, and used these as reasons to call her immoral. Yet the very act of living outside the accepted path was itself a continuation of her philosophy. She was not content to argue for freedom on paper. She tried to live it, even when the cost was scandal and isolation. Her daughter, Mary Shelley, inherited both her brilliance and her courage, going on to write Frankenstein, a novel that reflected its own rebellion against constraints of thought and imagination. The line between Wollstonecraft's thunderous call and the quieter defiance of later writers was direct and undeniable. While Wollstonecraft's rebellion took the form of words and ideas, and Lister embodied defiance in her very identity. Born into the landed gentry of Yorkshire, she inherited Shibden Hall and took on its management, a role that in itself was unusual for a woman. Yet it was not her management of estates that shocked her contemporaries most, but her refusal to hide who she was. Lister loved women, and she lived openly with them in ways that defied the rigid expectations of the time. She dressed in dark, tailored clothing that gave her a masculine air, earning her the nickname Gentleman Jack. She recorded her life in detailed diaries, much of it written in a secret code, where she chronicled her relationships, her ambitions, and her unshakable refusal to fit the mold assigned to her. Anne's determination to live authentically set her apart. She did not merely keep her desires private, she built a life around them. Most striking was her long-term partnership with Anne Walker, with whom she lived as if they were married. They even took communion together as a kind of symbolic wedding. In an age when same-sex relationships between women were often erased, denied, or treated as scandalous whispers, Anne claimed hers in both word and action. She also pursued roles in business and politics, asserting her place as head of her household and estates. Where most women were treated as appendages to their husbands or brothers, and stood as master of her own land, her defiance carried costs. She was mocked, gossiped about, and regarded as an oddity. Yet she did not yield. Her insistence on living her truth was not only a personal rebellion, but a profound statement about freedom. She showed that identity itself could be an act of resistance, and her life remains a rare and luminous example of a woman in the Regency world refusing to accept invisibility. Her coded diaries, now decoded, preserve the details of a life that was extraordinary not only for its boldness but for its unapologetic honesty. In Anne Lister, we see rebellion not in theory but in the practice of daily existence. Alongside these figures of radical thought and daring identity were women who, through their proximity to one of the most infamous men of the age, carved out a form of agency of their own. Lord Byron, with his dark charisma, his poetry, and his reputation as both genius and libertine, drew women into his orbit. Some were destroyed by him, but others used their connection to him as a way to assert themselves in a society that otherwise offered little room for self-expression. Lady Caroline Lamb, whose story already touched our exploration, was one of the most notorious, but she was not alone. Women who became Byron's companions or muses found themselves at the center of attention. Their names, often whispered with scandal, became part of his legend. Some leveraged this notoriety into visibility they would never have gained otherwise. In an age when women's reputations were guarded with suffocating care, these women turned notoriety into a kind of power. They may have been judged, mocked, or pitted, but they were not ignored. Teresa Giccioli, an Italian noblewoman, became Byron's companion in his later years. Through her relationship with him, she entered the currents of European politics and literature, moving in circles of influence. Her voice, which might otherwise have been silenced by her role as wife in a constrained marriage, found an outlet. Others, like Augusta Lee, Byron's half-sister, and Claire Clairmont, Mary Shelley's stepsister, carried the complicated legacies of intimacy with him. Their names forever linked to scandal yet also preserved in the history of ideas and art. What is striking about these women is not only their connection to Byron, but the way they navigated the public gaze. Where most women feared the ruin of reputation, they accepted risk for the sake of desire, love, or freedom. The very fact that they could not be erased, that their stories are still told, shows how their rebellion left traces. They remind us that defiance does not always take the form of manifestos or estates managed against the grain. Sometimes it is a choice to live fully, even in the face of certain judgment. The presence of Wollstonecraft, Lister, and Byron's women reveals the variety of ways open defiance took shape in this era. One declared in print that the structure of society was unjust, demanding education and equality. Another carved a life that embodied freedom of love and independence of property. Others turned notoriety itself into a platform, claiming space in history through scandal that might otherwise have silenced them. Each of these paths was different, yet all carried the same root: refusal. Refusal to be silent. Refusal to be invisible. Refusal to accept the cage as natural or inevitable. Together, they stretched the boundaries of what could be imagined. They were not revolutionaries in the sense of tearing down governments or leading armies, but they led revolutions of the self. Their lives suggested possibilities beyond the narrow roles assigned to women. possibilities that later generations would take up more loudly, more forcefully, and with greater success. The Regency era may appear at first glance as a period of elegance and order, but through the stories of these women, its surface cracks open to reveal unrest, ambition, and the first bold visions of freedom. The fan and the frock still fluttered across the ballrooms, but behind them were minds and lives daring to step into forbidden spaces. From the thunderclap of Wollstonecraft's pen to the coded defiance of Lister's diaries to the scandal-soaked names of Byron's muses, the quiet world was not so quiet after all. It hummed with suppressed energy, with defiance both whispered and shouted, with women who insisted that their existence meant more than obedience. These were the bold and the unconventional, and their courage ensured that the history of their time cannot be told only through the voices of men. The story of bold women who lived and created during the Regency years cannot end within the confines of their own time. To understand them fully, it is necessary to step beyond the ballrooms and salons, beyond the gossip and scandal, and look toward the longer echoes of their defiance. What Mary Wollstonecraft argued with her pen, what Lister embodied in her daily life, what Caroline Lamb dramatized in her passions, and what Elizabeth Montagu fostered in her salons did not vanish when they themselves were gone. Their choices, their art, their ideas, and even their scandals chipped away at the seemingly unshakable norms of their age. At first, the cracks were fine, barely visible, and to many contemporaries they may have seemed to amount to nothing more than eccentricities or isolated bursts of rebellion. Yet over time, those cracks spread. Their actions, both public and private, began to alter the way society imagined women, and they fed into the wider current of thought and activism that shaped later struggles for equality. The power of these women's legacies lies in the fact that their lives offered alternatives. They showed, each in her own way, that the rigid boundaries of gender were not as inevitable as they seemed. Mary Wollstonecraft's demand that women receive serious education forced people to confront the injustice of denying half the population access to learning. Even though many dismissed her arguments at the time, labeling them dangerous or unfeminine, her ideas did not disappear. They circulated in print, they inspired debate, and they reached young women who saw in her words a mirror of their own frustration. Over the decades that followed, reformers pushing for access to schools, universities, and professions would return again and again to the ground she had broken. The fact that girls today enter classrooms without their presence being questioned is part of her legacy, even if it took centuries for her vision to unfold. And Lister's legacy is of a different kind, but no less significant. In her coded diaries, she wrote with remarkable honesty about her loves, her ambitions, and her place in the world. At the time, her neighbors might have mocked her, and her society might have scorned her masculine manner and her open partnerships with women, but her refusal to hide planted seeds that would flower much later. She lived her truth in an era that had no language to honor it. In doing so, she created a record that challenges modern assumptions about the past. For too long, history painted earlier centuries as devoid of queer lives, or treated them as whispers at the margins. Anne's words prove otherwise. She lived openly with Walker, managed her estates with authority, and documented it all. Today, she stands as a symbol of resilience and authenticity, a figure whose courage offers inspiration for anyone facing the burden of social stigma. The fact that her diaries are now celebrated, studied, and even dramatized reveals how much the world has shifted, and how much her defiance mattered. The women who became Byron's companions, muses, and lovers may not have written treatises or left behind diaries as extensive as in Lister's, but their legacies also ripple outward. By refusing to remain silent, by daring to love boldly or to write novels that revealed private scandals, they demonstrated that women could seize narrative power even when society tried to shame them into silence. Lady Caroline Lamb, for instance, might have been mocked for her dramatic behavior, yet her decision to publish Glenarvan was a form of reclaiming her story. She refused to be merely a character in Byron's legend. She insisted on writing her own. That act of authorship, however messy or criticized, chipped away at the assumption that women should remain quiet victims of reputation. Similarly, women like Teresa Giccioli navigated the complex world of politics and literature through their connections, finding ways to wield influence in spaces where formal power was denied to them. Their legacies remind us that even notoriety can be transformed into agency, and that women were finding creative ways to insert themselves into the historical record. The cumulative impact of these women's actions was not immediate transformation. The Regency did not suddenly usher in equality. The strict codes of propriety, the laws of property, the expectation of marriage as transaction, all of these remained firmly in place. But each act of rebellion, each scandalous choice, each published work left traces that built upon one another. Social change is rarely swift. It happens through ripples that gather into waves. These women, in living as they did, contributed to the current that would swell into movements later in the 19th century. When suffragists in the Victorian and Edwardian eras demanded the vote, they did so with the memory of earlier women who had claimed intellectual, emotional, and personal freedom. When reformers argued for women's education, they drew upon Wollstonecraft's insistence that reason and virtue could not be cultivated without it. When queer activists in the 20th and 21st centuries looked for history to affirm that love between women had always existed, they found in Lister's words waiting. When feminists spoke of reclaiming narratives, of telling women's stories in their own voices, they echoed Caroline Lamb's determination to write herself into history. The connections are not direct lines, but rather threads woven into a tapestry. These women did not create modern equality, but they contributed pieces to its foundation. Their legacies also help us understand the continuing struggle. The issues they faced, restriction of education, social policing of reputation, lack of control over property, condemnation of desire, may seem to belong to a distant past. Yet echoes of them remain. Even today, women often find their ambitions questioned or dismissed, their reputations scrutinized more harshly than men's, their bodies and loves politicized. The fight for equality is far from complete. By looking back at the Regency era, we see how long these battles have been fought, and how each generation inherits both the victories and the unfinished work of those who came before. Consider education. Wollstonecraft's demand that women receive proper schooling feels obvious to modern eyes. Yet across the world, millions of girls are still denied it. Consider identity. And Lister's courage in living as she chose resonates today in debates about LGBTQ+ rights, where people continue to fight for the freedom to love openly without fear of judgment or danger. Consider reputation. The harsh scrutiny faced by women connected to Byron finds its echo in the way contemporary women in public life are still judged more severely than their male counterparts for choices in love, expression, or ambition. These parallels remind us that history is not a distant mirror, but a living conversation. At the same time, these women's stories offer encouragement. They show that change can begin in small, personal acts. A book published under the name A Lady, a coded diary written in private, a salon open to discussion, a scandal turned into authorship. They remind us that even when transformation feels impossible, resistance is never wasted. Every word written, every choice to live authentically, every refusal to remain silent contributes to a legacy larger than one lifetime. To step beyond the ballroom is to see history not as a series of isolated scandals or eccentricities, but as part of a continuum. The Regency women who defied their roles were not anomalies. They were part of a lineage of resistance, linked to those who came before and those who followed. They took the fragile beginnings of possibility and expanded them. Their defiance was not always tidy, not always celebrated, and not always successful in their own lifetimes, but it mattered. It mattered because it showed that women could imagine different ways of being, and once imagined, those ways could never fully be forgotten. In our own time, the struggles they face continue in new forms. The expectation that women balance grace with achievement, beauty with intellect, modesty with ambition has not entirely vanished. The pressure of reputation still weighs heavily, especially in the age of constant public scrutiny. Yet the legacy of women like Wollstonecraft, Lister, Lamb, and Montague gives us tools to push back. Their lives remind us that to challenge norms, to live authentically, to speak truth in the face of dismissal, is not only possible but necessary. They remind us that history itself is shaped not only by rulers and laws but by those who refused silence, those who picked up pens and brushes, who opened doors to conversation, who dared to love boldly, who demanded equality, who lived on their own terms even when the world scorned them. The Regency era began with ballrooms filled with candlelight, with young women on display in gowns designed to attract the right match, with fans fluttering as symbols of elegance. But behind the fans and frocks, and eventually beyond them, were lives that disrupted the performance. Those disruptions did not overthrow society overnight, but they endured, rippling outward into the centuries. They continue to ripple even now, reminding us that the fight for freedom and equality is never confined to one moment or one age. It is a long unfolding story, and the women of the Regency are an essential chapter in it. The echoes of those women who defied the boundaries of the Regency world do not fade with the passing of centuries. Their stories continue to reverberate because they are not only historical anecdotes but living reminders of resilience, courage, and the search for identity in societies that restrict it. When we reflect on Mary Wollstonecraft's bold arguments for education, and Lister's uncompromising authenticity, Lady Caroline Lamb's refusal to be silenced, and Elizabeth Montagu's intellectual gatherings, we do not simply encounter figures of the past. We confront lessons that speak directly to us in the present. Lessons about what it means to find a voice in a world that tells you to remain quiet, what it means to claim space in a system that insists there is none for you, and what it means to live with integrity even when it costs you acceptance. These lessons, though born in the candlelit parlors and rigid drawing rooms of the early 19th century, retain their urgency today. The enduring relevance of their lives lies first in their resilience. The Regency world was built to contain them. Laws denied them property rights. Customs suffocated their individuality, and reputations could be destroyed by the smallest misstep. Yet within that world they persisted. They did not always win, and they often paid steep prices for their defiance, but they demonstrated again and again that resilience is not measured by victory alone. It is measured by the refusal to give up one's sense of self. Wollstonecraft endured poverty, scandal, and ridicule, but still she wrote, believing her words might open a door for others. Lister lived under constant scrutiny, yet she wrote her diaries with unflinching honesty, refusing to erase her own truth. Caroline Lamb was mocked for her passion and branded as mad, yet she chose to write her own version of her story, rather than let others define her. Montagu cultivated intellectual life in an era that mocked learned women, yet she persisted in creating spaces where conversation could flourish. Their resilience shows us that even when freedom feels distant, dignity and self-expression can still be claimed. Their courage is equally instructive. Courage is often imagined as dramatic, but in reality it is lived in countless small choices. For Wollstonecraft, courage was putting her pen to paper and publishing ideas she knew would scandalize polite society. For Lister, it was walking through her village in attire that defied expectations, knowing she would be gossiped about. For Lamb, it was declaring openly in print what others preferred to whisper about in scandal sheets. For Montagu, it was opening her drawing room to men and women alike, insisting that conversation and intellect belonged to both. These acts may seem simple to us now, but in their time they were radical. Their courage was not only in what they did but in the risks they accepted. Loss of reputation, financial ruin, loneliness, and even exclusion from their communities. In studying their lives, we are reminded that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act in spite of it. Perhaps most of all, their stories teach us about the importance of finding one's voice. In a society where silence was considered the highest feminine virtue, every act of speaking, writing, or creating was a rebellion. To pick up a pen and write about marriage laws, to publish a novel dissecting the economics of courtship, to sketch a portrait that revealed inner life rather than surface beauty, to record a diary in secret code about love between women, all of these were ways of saying, I exist, my experience matters, my perspective counts. In that sense, these women did more than challenge norms, they expanded the range of human voices in history. They ensured that women would not always be represented by others, but would begin to represent themselves. For us today, surrounded by the constant flood of voices in public and digital life, the reminder is powerful. It asks us to consider how precious the act of self-expression truly is, and how costly it was for those who first dared to demand it. Yet if we stop at admiration alone, we miss the deeper lesson. These women's lives are not only inspiring stories, but also windows into how societal constraints evolve. The Regency period was marked by strict codes of behavior, rigid gender roles, and inequitable laws. Those structures may look different now, but their echoes remain. We no longer require women to marry for survival in the same way, yet economic and social pressures still shape women's choices. We no longer bar women from education, yet disparities in opportunity and recognition remain. We no longer demand that love remain hidden in codes, yet prejudice and stigma continue to threaten those who live authentically. What history shows us is that progress does not erase struggle, it reshapes it. The constraints evolve, sometimes becoming subtler, but they persist in new forms. Understanding this helps us grasp why continued advocacy is vital. Wollstonecraft's call for education was revolutionary in her time. Yet even now, girls around the world are denied schooling. The harsh judgment that fell on Byron's companions echoes in the way women in public life today are scrutinized for their choices in ways their male counterparts are not. These connections show us that the fight for equality is not finished. It is not enough to honor these women as historical curiosities. Their struggles remind us of the work that remains. They also remind us of the cost of complacency. The freedoms we enjoy today, freedom of education, of property, of authorship, of love, of speech, exist because women before us insisted on them, often at great personal cost. To take these freedoms for granted is to forget the battles that secured them. To assume that progress is irreversible is to risk losing it. Each generation must decide whether to defend and expand these freedoms, or allow them to be eroded. The lives of Wollstonecraft, Lister, Lamb, Montague, and so many others are not only inspirations but warnings. They show us what silence costs, and what courage can achieve. And yet, alongside warning, their stories also call for appreciation. When a woman today enters a university, she walks on the path Wollstonecraft began. When two women walk hand in hand openly, they live the truth Lister fought to embody. When a woman writes a novel and signs it proudly with her own name, she honors the courage of Austen, of Lamb, of countless others who could not. When conversations about ideas happen in living rooms, lecture halls, and online spaces, they continue the spirit of Montague's salons. The freedoms we hold are not abstract rights. They are lived realities made possible by centuries of defiance. To acknowledge this is to see our lives as part of a larger story, one shaped by those who dared to imagine more. Appreciating these freedoms does not mean ignoring what remains undone. It means holding gratitude and responsibility together. Gratitude for the women who chipped away at walls until cracks appeared, and responsibility to widen those cracks into doors for those who still find themselves shut out. Their resilience becomes our encouragement. Their courage becomes our standard. Their voices become our inheritance. As we close the story of these Regency rebels, we return to the image with which we began. The ballrooms, the fans, the frocks, the seemingly perfect world of grace and order. But now we know that behind that polished surface were women who were restless, brilliant, passionate, and brave. We know that beneath the rustle of silk gowns there were pens scratching arguments for freedom, brushes sketching visions of individuality, diaries recording forbidden love, and salons alive with debate. We know that even in an age determined to contain them, women found ways to resist, to live authentically, and to imagine something more.
Their stories matter today because they show us that history is not only the tale of those in power, but of those who refuse to remain powerless. They matter because they remind us that progress is made not only in parliaments and courts, but in private letters, in novels, in whispered conversations, in choices to love and to live against the grain. They matter because they connect us across time, showing us that the struggles of the past are not as distant as they seem. And they matter because they invite us to honor the freedom we have by using them, speaking, writing, creating, living, so that the echoes of courage continue, not as fading notes, but as living voices carried forward. The legacy of those Regency women is not only that they broke rules, but that they taught us to imagine differently, They remind us that resilience, courage, and voice can survive even in the most restricted times. And they remind us that the freedoms we hold today were not handed down gently, but struggled into being by lives of struggle and disobedience. To remember them is to remember that the story of freedom is never finished, and that each of us is called to carry it forward.